Hey everyone, welcome back to inspiroue. Today we're going to be breaking down the fashion industry model, the entire fashion supply chain from fiber to landfill or a recycling facility, what it currently looks like, especially in the fast fashion model, everything that you should be conscious of as a consumer in order to push for more ethical and sustainable fashion, how to make better choices and what questions to ask. It's amazing that we're becoming more conscious as consumers and pushing for ethical and sustainable production, but there are so many layers to it, and I think that a lot of it we haven't even touched. We've just skimmed the surface. So I hope that this video can help start conversations, spark curiosity. And I also want to say, I didn't go to school for this. I'm just a passionate consumer who likes to learn and do research. So if you know stuff about this, please comment down below. Let's have conversations. Let's educate each other. This is just the beginning. I'm sure I'll probably update this with more iterations in the future. But yeah, I hope that you find this helpful. Please leave a like if you like this type of content. I've also shared these graphics over on Instagram, so please go like, share, repost. It would mean the world to me, and let's get into it. So we all have a pretty good idea of what the fashion industry consists of, right? From fiber to yarn to textile, where it's made into fabric, and to the garment manufacturers that make them into clothing, that cut the patterns, and then it goes into distribution centers and warehouses, and then it goes to the stores, and then we as consumers buy it. And then once it's done, it goes into the landfill, right? That is the traditional linear fashion model. In this model, here are all of the things that are happening. These are all the things that we should be considering at each step. So starting from the fiber, we have synthetic and natural fibers, where synthetics are man-made like polyester and natural fibers are grown from crops like cotton. And just from this step, and I'm going to focus on the natural fibers, we're like, oh, natural fibers are better, right? But let's say you're choosing cotton. All the water and the chemicals that go into growing cotton, and then all the pesticides, the GMO crops, the soil erosion and degradation that comes from using chemicals that makes the land that these crops are grown on unusable, that is all stuff that we need to think about just in this step. And then on top of that, what about the farmers? Who's harvesting these crops? Recently, Fashion Revolution shared these graphics, which I'll link to below, about the Uighur crisis, where there are forced labor camps, and most of the world's cotton, I think, originates from these camps. A lot of brands have claimed, oh, we don't use cotton from there, oh, blah, blah, blah. But the more that I think everybody dug into it, the more we realized that people don't know where the raw materials are coming from because it's so disconnected from the fashion industry. So when a brand claims that their clothing is ethically produced, does it also mean that the materials that go into the clothing are ethically produced? I don't think so. That's something that we need to think about. So that is just from turning the fiber into the yarn, okay? Just using the Uighur, I think it's pronounced Uighur, I hope so. Just using that as an example. So these camps, they spanned from the farmers and the harvesters all the way to the textile manufacturers. A lot of the industries, they will cover multiple parts of the supply chain because vertically integrating saves money. It really depends. Anyway, so once the fiber is harvested, it needs to become yarn, right? Whether it's spun or whatever. Honestly, there isn't a lot of information on this. A lot of articles kind of skim this or skip it and just go directly into the fabrics. From what I pick up on though, it seems like it used to be very labor intensive, but now it's very machine heavy and automated. Are there chemicals at this step? How much energy is being used? I'm sure there are still people manning these machines. I'm sure there are people that still need to overlook them. I'm hoping that they're ethically treated and employed. Question mark? Who knows? After you have the yarn, it needs to become textile or fabric. This is a whole industry that's typically grouped into the garment worker and garment manufacturing industry, but the textile industry is where fabrics are dyed or treated to be dyed and processed before they're cut and sewn into clothing. This is the industry that causes the rivers to be dyed different colors of the rainbow each fashion season. It's the industry where workers are treating fabrics and dyeing them and making sure they're the right textures and the right colors before they're cut and made into clothing. When they're working with chemicals and dyes and all of this, can we confidently say that they are working ethically? Are they working in safe conditions? Probably not, right? And to dive deeper into that, there are so many layers dependent on the type of textile industry. So for example, denim It's a huge conversation. It's a whole other video. But in denim, you know how you have different washes for jeans? Like sand-blasted denim, people are literally blasting sand on denim in order to give it that wash. And it's something that, again, ethical treatment of a worker in one type of textile doesn't mean that a worker in a different textile category is treated ethically either. Like there's so much. Anyway, and that's just on the worker side of the textile industry. So when we're talking about all these dyes, all the chemical dyes and the runoff from the textile part of the industry that goes back into our earth, that's also something to consider, right? I've talked a lot about toxic sludge from like the denim dyeing process and everything. How do we know that brands are using manufacturers that are cleaning this? So once we have fabrics, then we have the garment manufacturing industry. This is the one that's well known, the most talked about, but I hope that even just how far we've come already, you see how there are so many other layers that we need to be pushing for ethical labor in. But examples of this are all the factories with sweatshop-like conditions, and even like LA where they're paid by piecemeal, or in developing countries where they don't make living wages and all of that stuff. One part that I didn't call out in this graphic, just to make it easier, is the pattern cutting, where sometimes it's sent off to a different manufacturer to do it. Sometimes it's absorbed into their entire process if they like touch multiple points, but that's something else to consider. It's also something that doesn't really have that much info on it either, but the one thing I do know is that the people that are making the clothes aren't typically the ones that are cutting the patterns in the typical fashion model. And then another thing we need to think about is all the trim that goes into the clothing. Buttons, zippers, labels, where are they coming from? Who is making them? Are they treated ethically? Are they made sustainably? Who knows, you know? Is it a monopoly? Is it just a few brands that are supplying these? Like, what is the conversation there? After that, you have the clothing items, and then they're shipped to the distribution centers, the warehouses. In the mass market industry, they're big like Zara. I think they have and own multiple that they use for themselves, especially because they produce so much. Or some brands use warehouses where multiple brands store their clothing items. Again, whole industry there. There's a lot of shipping, emissions, packaging, energy that's used at this step. And then from these distribution centers, they're shipped to retail locations, which again, energy, emissions, waste. And then you have the hang tags for these garments. You have the plastic packaging that clothes are usually wrapped in, all of that waste. And then you have the consumers. So we go into these shops, we buy, and then here in the mass market model, people just consume, they wear less, they dispose more. There's like a whole mindset there. We've talked about that so much on this channel already. And then after the consumers are done with it, it goes into the landfills, or it's burned, or it's shipped across the world and burned. I've talked about the emissions and the energy used in each of these parts of the supply chain, and now think about everything as a network around the world. Having to ship between each of these different steps, all the energy used in each of these different steps, and with all of these industries working together, this is also leading to really bad environmental impact around the world. We have biodiversity loss, we have land degradation, we have climate change. It's all working together, but because it's spanning so many different industries, they can get away with saying it's not solely caused by them. And I think there's so much like government regulation that needs to happen there. But anyway, so we've kind of talked about the entire fashion industry, right? I think it's important to remember that this is also just a high level generalization, where in each of these like components and parts of this model, there are entire industries, different industries, depending on like the type of textile or the type of fiber. And there's so many variables there. But I hope that this is going to help you visualize kind of all of the different steps. Now that we've broken that down, let's look at how the industry has evolved and look at the more conscious, ethical, and sustainable choices that we can be making at each of these different points. I'm always going to stress that our individual impact matters as consumers, because collectively, our dollars and our purchasing power can shift industries if we are choosing better. And I'm always going to push for that and advocate for that, because that's what we can do. I know that there's a lot of change that also needs to happen from brands, and a lot of change that needs to happen from governments. Please go vote if you're American. But anyway, let's dive into what a more sustainable and responsible industry looks like. I think starting with the fiber is very important because at the end of the day, when we're done with garments, we want to make sure that they can break down and go back into the earth in a reasonable amount of time. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to have this like waste built up in our landfills, and that's not sustainable, right? So the first thing to think about is lower impact fibers, using less water and energy, hopefully using no harmful chemicals to grow them. And I think here I lean more towards natural fibers because at the end of the day, they're compostable and they biodegrade in a shorter amount of time than synthetics. I don't want to dive too much into fabrics and fibers because I'm already working on a whole video on it. There's so much there because there are so many different types of fibers. I think those are just like two things to think about, where a truly responsible fiber is produced in a way where the land isn't damaged, it can still be used, in a way where there's less water and chemicals. And then from fiber to yarn, I think the important thing to stress here is traceable and ethical raw materials, where when we talked about this in our typical industry, a lot of fashion brands don't know where their raw materials are coming from. This is when you get into like the second tier and third tier suppliers of like raw materials and manufacturers. There's a huge disconnect right now, and I'm sure a lot of that is because of the way the mass market industry produces, where they can't support ethically sourced fibers. I know that there are brands that focus on a truly traceable and transparent supply chain. For example, cotton is one that I think is doing something like that, but I want to research it more before I talk more about it. And then at this yarn step where you're turning fiber into yarn and you're weaving it into like fabrics too, I think the one thing that's really important is preserving and promoting the craftsmanship that goes into like hand looming and all of the artisans that also know this craft. I know that there are small, like slow fashion labels that work with these artisans where all of the fabric is like hand loomed and hand woven. I think that's amazing. And I think the important thing to note here is that if we're going to support this, what is the production level that can sustain? It's a very, very small one compared to what we're used to right now. And I think that makes sense. And I think there's also something beautiful in knowing that even in this step where the fiber is turned into yarn and fabric, when it's handmade or when it supports a traditional craft versus being done with a machine. The next is the textile factories and the manufacturers. And I think there are two major components here. The first being lower impact processes. So we're seeing a lot more innovation when it comes to closed loop processes. So they're like reusing the same water, let's say, or they're doing it in a way that uses less energy, that uses no like harmful chemicals. I think one example is like the Saytex denim factory, which I'm so obsessed with. And you know that when these factories care, they're also making sure that any of the waste or any of the leftover like things from these processes are cleaned before being put back into the environment. For example, wastewater from the dyeing process always has this like toxic sludge. Our brand's removing it. I've talked about that in another video. The other component to this is the dyes that go into turning fabrics different colors. We're seeing a lot more brands use plant-based dyes and botanical dyes, or at least no harmful chemical dyes. And I think that's like the Ecotech certification too. So there's a lot to look out for there. I think we should expect more as consumers for brands to be transparent with the factories that they work with at this step. Multiple brands can use the same factory. For example, the Saytex denim factory. Eileen Fisher produces their denim there. Everlane, which we're still boycotting, produces their denim there. And what's important to note here is that if we know what these more sustainable and responsible factories are at this level, the brands that work with them, they just produce different styles, right? Which I think is cool because all of our styles are different. But if we know that the foundation of that, where all the production actually goes into it, where the responsible choices are being made that can help us become more conscious consumers. So I think that's really cool. And then in the textile and the garment industries, the garment industry one is the more mainstream one. I think ethical labor, fair wages, ethical working conditions is table stakes and should be the bare minimum. So I don't want to talk about it too much because I think it's like pretty straightforward, right? Obviously there are so many different types of workers in this entire supply chain. So how do we actually know that everyone along the way is treated fairly? But that's something that we should obviously constantly ask about and expect. And then this trims industry with like buttons and zippers and labels, like I think there's a lot to unpack there too. So I'm just gonna skim over it, but we obviously want one, to like know where these are coming from, who's making them, and then if they're made responsibly. I know when it comes to smaller brands, they will use like labels with like plant-based ink and like that are compostable and stuff, but I don't know, there's like a lot there. And then next is the distribution centers, the warehouses, the scale of this like global distribution network. I think under a more sustainable model, obviously you're producing based on pre-orders or by demand. So instead of overproducing and then marking things down on discounts and all of that, we're just producing what people want to buy. I think one, you want to localize everything as much as possible, right? So not just the distribution centers, but even like from where you're getting your materials and your fabrics to like the headquarters of the office of the brand to their factories and to where their like inventory is stored, trying to make it as hyper local as possible to cut down on all of the transportation needed between all of these different parts. It's something that makes sense, but obviously under the traditional mass market fashion industry, it's just everywhere because it's like whatever you can get the cheapest. If we're just producing what we want, is there even a need to have these like really big like warehouses? I think the other important thing to note is that bigger brands like Zara probably have their own warehouses around the world, and then other brands typically use like the same warehouse will have different brands. And that's just a way to like save money if you're a smaller brand, especially if you're selling around the world. It doesn't make sense to like own your own warehouses and like take care of all the ops and logistics, because that's again a whole other industry. And I know I say this a lot, but when there's a whole other industry in this model, you're looking at, okay, with the ops of like shipping something or storing something in a warehouse, the plastic and the packaging, the stickers and the labels with the barcodes that go into that, how can that be more sustainable too? And of course, next is retail. All the stores where the easy, bare bones ways to be more sustainable are to use like compostable hang tags and packaging and like shopping bags, or to fuel your store with like solar energy or something. I think the retail landscape, the brick and mortar landscape is going to change drastically, or even move to online in a more sustainable like industry. Obviously this is looking way into the future. I don't know, like the concept of shopping malls, I don't know how much of that makes sense with a more sustainable and conscious model. And then it goes to the consumer, where in this whole model, if we are one, being more conscious of supporting better fibers and better like production processes, it obviously impacts the rest of this chain. But it's obviously wearing clothes longer, taking care of our clothes better, swapping with our friends, prolonging the life of a piece of clothing in our own wardrobes. And then of course we have the secondhand thrift market, but that is different. I think that is part of the retail industry. And I think the important thing to note with thrifting is, yeah, it's amazing based on what our industry is right now, but 90% of the clothes that we donate still ends up in landfills, or it ends up being shipped around the world to be burned. And that's also something to note, where brands also do that with unsold inventory to like preserve their brand status, which is something that like else that is crazy. If you're producing what people want and only producing enough of it to match what people want, you wouldn't have leftover inventory, right? But the other thing I want to talk about with thrifting specifically, which I don't think a lot of people talk about right now, is the secondhand and thrifting industry can only really thrive if it's based on a foundational fashion industry that's made responsibly and intentionally. So it's obviously great right now that we can thrift and prolong the life of clothes before they end up in landfills, but a lot of the clothes that are being pumped into the secondhand market right now are fast fashion, obviously, because everyone is shopping fast fashion. And fast fashion is low quality, it doesn't last as long, it's gonna break down faster. So how many hands can these pieces of clothing actually like go through before they end up in the landfills? And once they're there, because they're made out of cheap fabrics, they probably won't break down, and they probably can't be reused or recycled either, right? So as we're thinking into the future in a more sustainable model, if we're producing high quality pieces of clothing that are going to last longer, they'll obviously be kept in this cycle for longer because they're made well, right? And then also, if they're made responsibly, they're probably made with a fiber that can be recycled and reused, or that's going to compost and break down pretty fast. Yeah, I hope that makes sense, but I'm sure I'll speak to that in another video, like the tea around the thrifting industry. In this model, I made the landfills icon smaller because I think that there's obviously always going to be a little bit of like fiber or whatever that's gonna end up in the landfills. But I wanted to highlight recycling facilities. More and more brands are using like recycled fibers or making things that can be broken down, and then the fiber is reused to make new clothing. It starts with using good fibers that can be compostable or reused and strong enough to reuse. So right now, a lot of the fibers that we're recycling are plastic fibers or synthetic fibers, where eventually they'll still end up in the landfills and take years and years to break down, right? The other cool thing here is that in the closed looped industry, we're just using fibers from the fashion industry. In an open loop, we're taking fibers from different industries. So example, plastics from fishing nets, plastics from recycled plastic bottles, using that to make fashion. And I think that's also really cool. But again, a lot of different layers if you're going to open up to using things, using materials from other industries. To like really simplify it, if we're starting off with a fiber that is going to biodegrade and compost in a reasonable amount of time, then at the end of a garment's life, if it can be broken down, I think that's really good. I think the issue right now in a very linear fashion industry is it ends with a lot of garbage that's just gonna sit there in our planet, or a lot of plastics that are gonna like sit in our oceans, right? So how do we create clothing in a way that at the end of its cycle doesn't harm our environment as much as possible? I feel like that's the high level question that we want to ask. I'm sure this is a very long video already, so I'm going to end it there. Obviously there's so much more that goes into this, but I hope that this can help break it down in a visually like understandable and not too overwhelming way. I think it's great that we're pushing for more ethics and sustainability in this industry, but I think in order to push for a truly ethical and sustainable one, we need to be aware of and conscious of all of these variables and components that actually go into the fashion supply chain. And I think we need to talk about that more. And a lot of the times, I think brands and whole industries can get away with what they've gotten away with because it's so disconnected, so global, and obviously there's a lot of government regulation that has to go into this. And obviously there's a lot that brands also need to commit to, but this is to stress what we can control as consumers, what we have power over, because I do believe that our individual impact matters, because collectively as consumers, we vote with our dollars. So I hope that this can help. Please leave a like if you like these types of videos. Please leave a like if you found this helpful, because a lot of research and time went into this. I really wish that they taught these in schools and universities, you know what I mean? Like if there was a program about this when I was growing up, I would have loved it. I'm just a consumer who's doing her research and trying to help educate others, but please let me know if there are programs on this, or like if you learn this from somewhere, and if there are better breakdowns, because from Google searches and stuff, like none of this is laid out in a digestible way. And I think that that's a problem, because the key to a more sustainable future is education, right? These graphics are going to be on my website, so if you want to like download them or share them or use them as a resource, please check them out there. I know that they are not the most like readable, especially on Instagram, which when I was designing them I was like, okay, this is getting way too out of hand, but there's just like so much like info to unpack. But I'm sure in the future I'll spend more time kind of iterating on it and designing it in a way that's more accessible. But for now, I just want to put this out there and start this conversation. So I hope that you enjoyed and find it helpful. But yeah, I love you guys so much. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye everyone.